Hello and welcome to our analysis of iCAT05, part of our All India National Level CAT Test series for CAT 18. With iCAT5, we finally move on to the last 5 mocks for this season. So by now, in the first 20 mocks, you would have attempted mocks of varying difficulties with various sections, verbal, DILR and font ranging from easy to super tough. Let's divide the analysis for this mock into 3 parts as we've been doing all along. So there'll be 3 videos, one devoted to each part. In the first part of our analysis here, we will look at the verbal ability section in greater detail. Before we go into that section, we look at the overall difficulty of the mock, which has been classified as a moderate to tough mock. Now, why is that the case? As you can see, mathematically, the difficulty of this mock has been pegged somewhere around 1.95. Now, what does that mean? It means that if I assign a value of 1 to an easy question and 3 to a tough question, then each question on an average in this mock was just below moderate. How does this compare to the actual CAT? In the actual CAT, our faculty have ascertained that the overall difficulty hovers somewhere between 1.9 to 1.95. So in that sense, it was more or less similar to the actual CAT, but we need to go into greater depth within each section and see how it was structured. So when we go to the verbal ability section, we observe that it was a very tough section. In fact, we would say that this was the toughest verbal section of all 21 mocks released so far, with an average difficulty close to 2.2. Typically, this is the kind of difficulty level associated with the DILR section rather than the verbal section. Generally, in verbal, the difficulty level is somewhere around 1.85. So if you look at this number and the number for this mock, you would say that this mock had a verbal that was nearly 20% tougher than what you can expect. So if you did even reasonably okayish in this section, you would be really set for CAT. The purpose of including such a tough verbal section here was just to give you an experience, as you shall see in part 2 of the analysis, where DILR was actually simpler than this. So this was more to give you an experience of a mock where DILR and verbal really switch places, and there is a slightly more moderate DI and a very tough verbal instead of the typical tough DI moderate verbal. So let's go into greater detail as far as this section is concerned. As you know, DILR always has 24 RC questions, generally split over 5 passages, and 10 non-RC questions, which include numeric entry or theta questions, as well as para summaries, which are MCQs. Now, because these are two discrete sets, it makes sense to analyze them separately. So let's start off with the RC questions first. The most common format, as we always have been mentioning and also followed in this mock, is where we have 3 RCs with 6 questions each and 2 RCs with 3 questions each. So this was also followed in this particular mock. The sequence of RCs might keep changing from mock to mock. Let's look at the individual RCs first. So here, when we look at these RCs, generally we observe that people focus on just the subject matter of the RC. We also recommend that people should look at the length of the RC, that is in terms of the word count or word length, and the number of questions. Of course, apart from that, you need to look at the difficulty level, but that's typically something that can happen only after the mock, where you know the LOD of each question and you can analyze whether that mock should have been attempted or not. Now here, when we look at a section like this, which was incredibly tough, the first thing that I would notice is that all my areas here, all the passages here, were from areas that were very dense to read. So if I look at all these topics, they actually remind me of CAT in the era 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, where the entire RC section used to be dominated by areas like psychology, sociology, philosophy, literature, classics, economics, etc., which were very dense to read. Here, if you read this, this was from literature. This was again the third passage was based on an author called Cervantes who wrote the very famous Don Quixote book. The first one, which was technically the simplest of the passages, was based on something called normative practices, again very difficult to read. Then there was a passage on a girl or lady called Alice Munro, and finally one on family institutions. So if you look at this, these were not really similar to what we would find in a typical CAT, where there is a lot of recent socio-political topics being covered or areas of social interest being covered in the mock. So here, frankly, selecting on the basis of this would have been very difficult. Again, when I look at the when I look at the difficulty level of the questions, moderate, moderate, nearly tough, moderate to tough, just below moderate. So on a post facto basis, yes, I know that this RC might have been the one to be tried, but there were only 3 questions here. So here when I look at it, there is no clear RC that emerges as something that should have been attempted. Of course, there are a couple of RCs that are good candidates for not being attempted. For instance, when I look at the RC on literature, it was a very long RC with nearly 1200 words. So very typical IFT length RC and a ZAT style RC. That increases the difficulty level manyfold. Also, as we can see, the questions were very tough. So on the whole, this was one RC that should definitely have been skipped. Similarly, when I look at the RC on family institutions, nearly 900 words, so more or less IFT length, moderate questions. But here the good part, like this, was that there were 6 questions. So if there were 1 or 2 questions that you might have been able to do, then it would have been a decent performance. So here, if I look at all these RCs, what I would really recommend is that you should have read and tried to do 1 or 2 questions. Every RC might have had one easy question somewhere. So except for this one, everywhere you possibly could have tried to read the RC and try and do that 1 or 2 question that you felt was doable. Now, even if this gave you somewhere around 6 or 7 attempts in all, and believe me, this is a very low number typically, but even if this gave you somewhere around 7 attempts in all, this was a reasonably good performance because of the overall difficulty of this section. So sometimes a lot of students keep a certain number in mind because their faculty or their experts have told them so. Yes, that number is important, but in a scenario where the mock is on standard expected lines, when the mock is so unique, where or so non-standard really, so as to say where the number of attempts has really gone down or the difficulty has gone up, you can always clear the cutoff even with fewer attempts. So here, if you were to ask me which was the RC that should have been attempted, I would say I just cannot decide, because each of the RCs was on a dense matter. It was something that would depend on the person's comfort level. Broadly, in readability terms and considering the length of the RC, this is potentially the only RC where I would say that yes, you should have definitely tried this. But on the whole, there's no real RC that emerges as a clear winner. So what I would have done as a student, had let's say this section come in the exam, would be to try and read each of these passages and mark those 1 or 2 questions where I feel I am fairly sure. So it is a little bit like scraping the barrel, but sometimes that is all you can do. So in such a tough section, that's the best possible approach rather than trying to aim at the moon and not even reach the 5th floor. Having looked at the RCs, sometimes we realize that it's a much better strategy to also look at the non-RCs and try and maximize my marks there. So consider the non-RC questions here. The overall breakup was the same as the one always followed, that is 4 jumbled sentences, 3 contextual odd man out questions and 3 para summaries. The contextual odd man out questions are typically those where we have jumbled sentences that can be arranged in a paragraph, and after that one sentence can be eliminated because it does not fit into the context of the paragraph. Here, as we can see and as has been the trend in the last few mocks, the contextual odd man out questions were actually simpler compared to the jumbled sentences. In this particular mock, all the jumbled sentences were on the tough side, whereas the contextual odd man out questions were all on the easier side. The para summaries again, which are risky because they are MCQs, were on the moderate to tough side. So if I see this and if I try and again scrape the barrel, because here there are a large number of tough questions, what I would have to try and do is try and attempt somewhere around 3 to 4 questions in this area. When I talk of 3 to 4 questions, what I mean is that these are the questions where you are fairly confident that you've marked the right answer. Otherwise, technically speaking, for all the numerical entry questions, which includes the jumbled sentences and the contextual odd man out questions, you should at least mark some answer even if you get the right answer by fluke. So if I look at number of attempts here, I would say for the RCs you needed to have somewhere around 7 attempts. For the non-RCs, you could have tried to get 3 to 4 attempts. On the whole, if you were to ask us, we would say that anywhere close to 10 to 11 attempts in this particular mock. And when I say attempts, these are your really serious ones. 10 to 11 good attempts in this mock would be a fairly good performance in order to clear the sectional cutoff. Let's just have a look at this third graph, which will tell us about the difficulty level in a little more detail. As you can see in this particular graph, the LOD of each question has been mapped from question 1 to 34. The blue lines indicate the MCQs, while the maroon or pink, or the orange or pink lines really indicate the numerical entry questions. So as you can see, let's just have a look at the first graph here, the first RC. The first question on normative practices is tough. So if you attempted it, the high chances that you go wrong. But then there are a couple of easy questions. So if you've read the passage and potentially identified these questions, then this is something that can be tried. Similarly, when I look at these two passages on literature and Cervantes, literature has straight away 4 and 1, 5 tough questions, just one easy question right at the end. Typically, in such a long passage with 6 questions, it becomes really difficult to identify an easy question. So this is a kind of passage that you might really have skipped. Again, on the passage on Cervantes, only moderate to tough questions. So had you been able to attempt one here and there, it would have been fine. Otherwise, this was something again possible to be skipped. On the other hand, if I look at this passage on Alice Munro, this is the one with the most even breakup throughout the mock. There are 2 easy, 2 moderate and 2 tough questions. Especially the good thing is that the easy and moderate questions are towards the beginning. So here, with a little bit of intelligent reading or good reading, there was actually a possibility of attempting say 3 or 4 out of 6 questions. Similarly, in the last passage, when I look at this on family institutions, yes, it progressively fell from a tough question, then 4 moderate and 1 easy. So again, your selection of questions would be important with anywhere close to 2 to 3 attempts. So if you were to smartly select the questions, attempting around 7 to 8 questions might have been possible. Otherwise, yes, you could have marked 10, 12 questions also, but the chances of errors would increase dramatically. Let's contrast this with the numerical entry or theta questions. As we said, the contextual odd man out were easy, so there were 2 of them here and then 1 of them here again. However, all my jumbled sentences were tough, as can be seen here. And then my para summaries were either moderate or tough. So the key really would have been to try and focus on these easy questions and try and get the best possible outcome from the moderate ones. Taking this into account, 3 to 4 attempts might be a slightly reasonable performance. So on the whole, if we were to look at this particular section, we can say that anywhere around 10 to 11 attempts would actually be worth doing in order to clear the sectional cutoff. Let's have a look at one passage, let's say the one on Alice Munro. So when we go to this passage, this is the one. There's something confusing about the consensus around Alice Munro, and then her critics begin by asserting everything, etc., etc. So this is a slightly, it's based on, so when you read the passage, you realize that this person is somebody based in Canada, and this person is being either praised or criticized based on her views. So it's a passage with 3 pretty long paragraphs, and then when you look at the questions, you realize that most of the questions here are semi-inferential or inferential. What is the general approach of the literary fraternity towards Munro's works? So you need to look at the overall passage, see what the fraternity feels, and arrive at your conclusion as to whether they have been too harsh, or whether her caliber has dwindled, whether they praise her, etc. Which of the following can't be said about her writing? So there'll be 3 things here which will be given, again a semi-inferential passage, 3 things which will be mentioned or inferred in the passage, 1 which won't. So that the false statement will be your answer. What did the author feel after reading Munro's short stories? So here again you need to read the whole passage, especially focus on the area which mentions her short stories, and then you try and arrive at your answer. Any vocab question here, just as it says, what does the author mean by the word torpor? It generally means slowness or sleepiness or laziness. So firstly, you need to find the word within the passage, and then in this part of the passage, wherever you have it, you need to look at it in the context of the passage. So it's not really just the synonyms or antonym as you would do from a Barron's or any standard word list. It's really how the word has been used in the passage. So more a question of word usage rather than vocabulary. The author has quoted A.S. Byatt's opinion of Munro's writing to show what? Again here the keyword becomes the other person or the critic, that's A.S. Byatt. Go to that part of the passage, read the area around his writing, because sometimes the author may have quoted A.S. Byatt to reinforce a certain idea or contradict some other idea. For example, here option 3 itself says the contradiction in his own and Byatt's view of her work. Let's just go to the passage and look for Mr. Byatt. Yeah. It's an address I wouldn't want to move, and I didn't enjoy my recent visit. But the impulse to say that makes me wonder whether I'm some sort of big city chauvinist, or a misogynist, or autistic, or a decadent reader, deaf to the charms of simple sentences perfectly polished. And then the bracket says, Alice Munro excites the writer in me, A.S. Byatt says. There is something new to learn from her in every sentence. So, Mr. Byatt feels that yes, there is something that can be learned from Miss Munro, so a very positive review. Whereas the author says that it's an address I wouldn't want to move to. And he says her writing is polished and perfectly humorless. So he has a pretty negative view. So here when I read just this much, my first impression is that option 3, which says the contradiction in his own and Byatt's view of her work, seems more and more logical. Of course, this I am saying based on a very casual reading of the passage. You would have to read it in greater detail. So on the whole, if you read the passage once, then go to the questions and then read the passage in greater detail again, you might be able to eliminate a lot of options and then arrive at your answer. This way you can answer most passages, and you should try to answer them at home. As far as this particular section in the mock was concerned, just as we've concluded earlier, it was an extremely tough section in a moderate to tough mock. So the number of good attempts to clear the cutoff would really be very low. Even 10 to 11 might suffice. Parts 2 and 3 of this analysis will discuss in greater detail the DILR and quant sections. The analysis for all our previous mocks have been put up on our official YouTube channel, the link for which is given below. You can subscribe to our channel by clicking this link. To receive notifications every time a new video is put up, you need to click on the bell button. Please feel free to put in your comments, feedback, or any questions on the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.